the split had been widening between what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. But that came to a complete and permanent division in this century. Then, of course, there were the Christian and Muslim wars, which took place not only in the Holy Land, but spread into Europe, into parts of France and all of Spain. So it was a tumultuous time into which Dante was growing up. And religion was the prime mover. Now in our era, the 20th century, we probably would say, describing the 20th century, is that the prime mover of conflict was political ideology. Whether it was fascism, or communism, or capitalism, there was a political impetus for the conflict of the 20th century. Here, it's a religious motivation. And it's very important. It's one of those key background elements about the age that Dante grew up, and probably, well, it will have some distinct influence on the poem that he eventually wrote. Here's a second very important point about Dante. He's a native of Florence. He's a native of Florence. And I cannot think really of an equivalent significance in the modern age to someone who came from a particular city. In other words, Florence was not part of Italy. There was no unified Italy at the time. I've got a map that's going to show this in a little while. Florence was a city-state. There were a lot of city-states throughout Europe. And Florence was one of the leading city-states of the entire Western civilization. Florence stood out. And so to be a native of Florence was an enormous privilege and honor, and one that was very jealously guarded. You couldn't just move into Florence and become a native of Florence. If your family hadn't been anchored in Florence, for decades and centuries, you were nothing. So, and Florence wasn't the only city with this character, but Florence especially, in the age that we're talking about, it really had this significant place. And so Dante's identity started with him being from Florence. Why you'll see in a moment why that's important. Among many other things, first of all, what was Florence's claim to fame at this time? We were entering a modern age now. They were becoming the banking center of all of Europe. Prior to that, there were no banks, there were no lending institutions of any. Things were done more by barter. But now coinage was coming into broad use and was fueling what you might call a commercial revolution. And Florence was at the center of it. So the banking industry, to use a modern term, the banking industry was what was the economic driver for Florence. But Florence boasted a lot of other things. Any of you who have been to Florence or have seen photographs of Florence know what a gorgeous city it is. It has some of the architectural marvels of the world. A lot of them religiously inspired, some of the cathedrals and the churches, but other features. It is a marvel of a city. So they had that to brag about. Also, though, it was a progressive city in the sense that they had public schools. Now, this was unknown in Europe at the time. The only people who were educated were from the aristocracy. And Dante, his family was not aristocratic. His father was a usurer, a lender of money. But not sort of an elevated banker type, more someone who, in common parlance, he ran a pawn shop, right? There's a difference between a pawn shop and a bank. And so Dante's father was at the lower end of that scale. But still, Dante received a first-class education, which of course is what led to him eventually establishing a reputation as a poet, a very accomplished poet. This is, now I'm talking, his reputation was established before he wrote the comedy. He wrote several other poems, romantic, quasi-historical epics, but he had a well-established reputation before he ever came to the comedy. He was married with several children. We don't know exactly how many children he had, but we do know that for certain that he had 2 sons, because they did a lot of work about sort of restoring his name after his death. This, all the biographers for Dante will point to was his downfall. He had a lot going for him. He had a family, and he had married into a good family, the Donatis. So income, resources probably were not a great concern to him. So he could have lived as a teacher and as a working poet. They had working poets in those days, who usually were like artists, came under, were supported by benefactors, wealthy benefactors. So he could have lived quite happily with these 2 facts in mind. But he became involved in Florentine politics. And like I said, most of his biographers say it was his fatal decision. Because, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, I said a moment ago that religion was the prime mover behind conflict. That's true. But there was another large force at play at this time. And it was a rivalry that had been going on for probably a couple of 100 years, a long-riding rivalry between the Pope, representing the power and institution of the Church, and the Holy Roman Emperor, whose name changed constantly, by the way, over these decades. They were regularly deposed and reimposed, but you had these 2 centers of power, church and secular power. And while in foreign entanglements, religion was the ingredient that led to conflict, there was this ongoing conflict that affected all of the major parts of Europe. Italy, France, Germany, even extending into England. This rivalry and all of its repercussions was one of the things that Florence got drawn into. Why? For the reasons I gave you before about Florence itself. It was wealthy, it was sophisticated, it was accomplished, and it was progressive. So both the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope really wanted Florence as a jewel in their own crown. But, as I said, Florence was a fiercely independent, autonomous city-state. They did not want to be ruled by the emperor or by the Pope. But inevitably, you're in the middle of a landmass, and you're surrounded by what were called the papal states, those territories that were under the direct control of the Vatican. Inevitably, you are going to be influenced by what's going on around you. And that happened in Florence. And so you'd have the emperor this week and the Pope the next week, all appealing to Florence to join their side, or to enlist in a campaign against some other enemy. It was going on constantly. And so Dante became one of the, what they call the priors, one of the key advisors of the city of Florence. It was a short-term assignment given to dignitaries of the city to help make decisions about the city's future. And he involved himself in this, and one particular dispute came up where the Pope appealed to Florence to provide, I think it was 100 knights for a particular military campaign that the Pope was launching against France. And so this body of priors, this body of advisors gathered in Florence, just like a session meeting. And the motion was made, and the motion was debated, and a vote was taken, and lo and behold, the one person who voted against the Pope was Dante. Now, at the time he did that, he was on solid ground, because the Pope had didn't have any particular inroads into Florence. But within 6 months, the Pope was, through some remarkable machinations, was able to infiltrate his allies into the power structure in Florence, and the next thing you know, Dante is exiled. Now connect that fact with what I was telling you before about the significance of being a native of Florence. To be exiled from any city, but especially from this city, was equivalent to being cast into hell. And that's exactly the way Dante viewed it. He not only was physically expelled from the city, but he lost all of his possessions. Biographers still are not certain as to whether he ever reunited with his family or not. Because the Donatis remaining, if his wife, for example, remained with the children in Florence, they at least had, they had a family structure to protect them and to sustain them. But if they had gone into exile with Dante, they would have had nothing, which is exactly what Dante ended up with, was nothing. Exiled in 1302 by the order of the Pope, completed the Inferno in 1314, and then Purgatory and Paradise followed. And of course were obviously completed before his death in 1321. One interesting thing is that for several years after Dante died in 1321, the last 6 cantos, chapters of Paradise were missing. They couldn't be found. And it was feared by those who were now trying to compile his works that he never completed the poem. And it turns out that one of his sons, you can imagine this is part legend, but it must have some truth to it. One of his sons had a dream of where his father had hidden the last 6 cantos. And when he awoke, he and a friend went to this hiding place, and sure enough, they recovered and they were able to complete the publication of the poem. As I said, there's some legend in there, but there's got to be some truth in it, because everyone recognized that at his death, 6 chapters of this overall poem were missing. Okay, so I've told you a lot about Dante. It's important, believe me. It's important as we go forward into the poem to have some of these facts in mind. But before I go on to my last slide, are there any questions?
Question. If,
yeah.
If he wrote it in 1314,
completed it in 1314.
Completed it, but he was exiled at that
yes.
point. Was it circulated, or was it a hidden document?
Well, because he had been expelled by the order of the Pope, some allies from the Holy Roman Emperor's realm came to his aid in the sense that they gave him enough. They gave him enough to live on, and to continue his writing. He was never restored to any particular prominence, and certainly not to any wealth. But it was enough to sustain him. So, does that answer your question, or?
I'm just wondering if the document saw any circulation at that time.
Yes, it was in circulation. The Inferno was published in 1314. one of the things we're going to learn is that in a lot of ways, this is not an orthodox poem. It is not a convention. It is not conventional Catholic theology, to be certain. And so there were places where it was published or where it was distributed, and they burned it. Okay, but there were enough copies, obviously, that survived in other parts of Europe. So that they could finally, at a particular point, be published in full. Okay, before we get to the text next week, I wanted to elaborate a little bit about the political situation. And this, I hope, I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this area here in salmon, or pink, these are called the Papal States. And of course, Rome here is at the southernmost part, and the city of Bologna is at the northernmost part. Now you can see how the Papal States, in fact, surround the city of Florence. Okay? Then to the north, you can see that the areas of what are now Germany, Austria, Switzerland were far more loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor than were these southern areas. So this is where the conflict between these great powers occurs. But every time one of these elephants stepped in a particular direction, they stepped on somebody. And which is my way of explaining how Florence got stepped on, or if not stepped on, drawn into something that they would have been quite happy to stay out of. They wanted, as I said, to remain autonomous. But this was happening all over the place. The city of Milan, the city of Genoa, these areas at different times faced the same problems that Florence did. But for our purposes, this is a very sort of telling picture. And one of the reasons that I stress this is that what we're going to find when we get to the poem next week is that so many of the people who populate hell are from the church. It's stunning. And you know who the lead one is? The Pope. Boniface. It was his name. He came to the papacy 1294 and lasted until 1303. But it was during that time, of course, that he was trying to steadily extend the influence of the Papal States. Just a real small snippet of history here. By the middle of the 13th century, say around 1250, as I said before, disputes had not only been going on, the resources of both the faith resources and the material resources had been drained into 200 years of just hopeless crusades in the Holy Land. That was one thing. And then, of course, over some of the same period, you had this competition between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. The consequence of this was to weaken all parties. And by the middle of the 13th century, around 1250, the papacy had been greatly weakened, almost to the point of collapse. In other words, not only were their material holdings in land dramatically reduced from what they had been, but their spiritual influence over people had almost evaporated because of decade after decade of warfare and corruption and fueling competition between one city and another. And everybody could see quite clearly who was at the root of this. It was the church. So one of the things, it's almost comic in a certain sense, but at least half the population of hell had a direct role in the church. Most of them were clergy. And if they weren't clergy, they were allies of the clergy. So this And this expresses Dante's view of what was going on. And of course, he is writing, as you have heard biographically, he's writing from a standpoint of bitterness. Deep, deep personal bitterness and loss. But even objectively, historians who have no stake in a poem of Christian devotion will quite readily concede that the papacy was a travesty, and that when Dante did describe the inhabitants of hell as utterly and completely sinful, historians would have nodded in agreement. Yeah, they were. So that's the picture, both the political, the historical, the state of, and I think this is most important for us as we go into the poem next week, the state of spiritual despair. That is key. And it wasn't only Dante who felt it. It was pervasive. Mary Jo.
Is it known where Dante went when he was in exile?
Well, he went to several places. There is no clear record, that you could track it on a map. But he stayed in Italy. He stayed in Italy, and of course gravitated northward. Obviously away from where the Pope had influence, and up into the area around Venice, and also to the west of Venice, into the area around Milan and Genoa. But he was a fugitive for the rest of his life, because I think because he attacked the Pope and the Church verbally after his expulsion. What had become, what was at first an expulsion order, became a death penalty. So that if they could ever either grab him, or if he ever for some reason tried to enter Florence again, he would be executed immediately. So he lived as a fugitive, very restless existence after a person who had, as I said, achieved quite a bit in his short life within Florence. Okay, so I'm going to close with this. This is where the poem begins, and this line here, in the middle of the road of our life, I awoke in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost. That's how the poem opens. And one of the reasons I think that this poem still has some traction with people, if they make the effort, is that, as I said in one of my notes, what he's describing in the opening verses of the comedy is a midlife crisis. It's a spiritual crisis, it's a psychological crisis, it's a physical crisis. And I think one of the reasons this poem continues 700 years after the fact to register with people is because people go through this. Another way of saying this, or another by the way, if you come across 6 English translations of the comedy, you're going to get 6 very different versions. So, another way that this could be, nel mezzo del cammin de nostra vita mi ritrovai. This verb, ritrovai, means literally, I found myself. Now this author says, or this translator prefers the word I awoke, which connects here. I awoke in a dark wood. But the reason that other people prefer to translate this is I found myself, okay, I found myself in a dark wood where the true way was wholly lost. So the contrast here is I found myself and I was lost. just another way of emphasizing the state of spiritual darkness at the beginning of this poem. And now, if I had told you nothing about the biography of Dante, you would still recognize this sentiment. And as I said, the reason I think this poem still, to this day, has such relevance to people is it doesn't matter what the dark wood is. None of us are going to be expelled from Buffalo, much as you might like in the winter. But we all either have or will encounter dark woods. And they will be physical, or they will be spiritual, or they will be psychological, or they will be community bred, or they will be family anchored. So the response that Dante is trying to communicate to us is, how does a faithful Christian respond in this circumstance? How is the true way regained? That's it for tonight. Until next week.